Welcome back to Thomas Tessier's World of Hurt. I'm Chris L. McKenna. Today's story was first published in 1992 in the anthology Meta-Horror, edited by Dennis Etchison, and is narrated by Yuri Lowenthal.
In Praise of Folly by Thomas Tessier. He drove north in air-conditioned comfort, a road map on the seat beside him, Satier's piano music rippling pleasantly from the stereo speakers. Thank God for the little things that make human life bearable when summer's on your neck. It was August. The stagnant heat and humidity were so heavy they no longer seemed like atmospheric phenomena, but had assumed a suffocating, gelatinous density. People moved slowly, if at all, dazed creatures in the depths of a fungal deliquescence. It had to be better up in the Adirondacks, cooler and drier, but Roland Turner was not just another vacationer seeking escape. He was on a mission of discovery, he hoped. A one-man expedition in search of a serious folly. Roland was one of the very few American members of the Folly Fellowship, an organization based in London that was dedicated to preserve and promote the enjoyment and awareness of follies, to protect lonely and unloved buildings of little purpose, unusual, intriguing, or simply bizarre structures and sites. Roland first learned about the group 2 years earlier, when he came across an issue of their quarterly magazine in a Connecticut bookshop. The photographs were fascinating, the text charming and witty. A typical English eccentricity, Roland thought at the time, the sort of thing that lasts for a year or two and then dies away as enthusiasm and funds decline. He wrote a letter to ask if the fellowship was still going, and was surprised to get a reply from the president and editor himself, one Gwyn Headley. Not only was the fellowship still active, it was thriving, with more than 500 members worldwide, most of them naturally residents of the United Kingdom. Roland immediately mailed off a bank draft to cover the cost of membership, a set of back issues of the magazine, a folder of color postcards, and a copy of Headley's definitive work, Follies, a National Trust Guide, Cape, 1986. There was something romantic and mysterious about monuments, castles, and old ruins that had always appealed to Roland. He saw the past in them, and he loved to imagine what life had been like so long ago. Perhaps it was because his own day-to-day existence was placid and humdrum. Roland owned a printing company, a small outfit that produced trade newsletters and supermarket flyers for the Westchester County market. Over the years, he had worked long and hard to build up a reliable trade, and now he presided over a solid, secure business operation. On the negative side, Roland's personal life was somewhat threadbare. He'd been through a number of brief, intimate encounters, but none of them even came close to marriage. Now, in his middle age, Roland could take it or leave it. He enjoyed a good book, mainly history or historical fiction, as well as classical music, and he had a special fondness for follies. A genuine folly was a building, garden, grotto, or other such architectural construct that had been designed with a deliberate disregard for the normal rules. A folly was something literally to gasp at, as Headley put in his massive tome. Roland had not yet been able to travel to Britain due to pressure of work, but he had managed to track down a few American follies, such as Holy Land in Waterbury and the Watts Towers in Los Angeles. He'd also visited a fully functional house that had been built out of beer bottles in Virginia, a 4-acre Sahara located in the Maine woods, and a home designed as Noah's Ark in the Tennessee hills. American follies tended to lack the air of lost grandeur that was the hallmark of classic British follies, but they often displayed a kind of heroic zaniness that was utterly endearing. Roland could only look forward to the time in his life when he would at last be free to spend 2 or 3 months journeying around England, Scotland, and Wales, leisurely expecting some of the remarkable things he could only read about now, such as the rocket ship in Aysgarth, the house in the clouds at Thorpeness, Clavel's Tower, and Port Marion, not to mention all the splendid follies that could still be found in and around the great city of London itself. Follies are the dizzy, demented lacework on the edge of the vast human tapestry, Roland had written in a letter that, for some unknown reason, Mr. Headley had not yet seen fit to publish in the magazine of the Follies Fellowship. In his spare hours, Roland continued to hone his thoughts and write up notes on the American follies he came across. Then, 2 weeks ago, the message had arrived from London. A rather spectacular folly was rumored to exist on the grounds of the old Jorgensen summer cottage in Glen Allen, New York. Would Mr. Turner be able to check it out and report back? If it proved to be a worthwhile sight, photographs and notes would be welcome. Roland immediately faxed his answer. Absolutely. It took a while to find Glen Allen on the map. Apparently a rural village, it was some 200 miles away, a little north of Big Moose Lake in the Adirondacks. Definitely a weekend trek. Get up there and find a rustic inn Friday evening, spend Saturday investigating the Jorgensen property, and then drive back down to Rye on Sunday. Roland fled the office at noon, and a few minutes later hit the turnpike. As far as anyone knew, he was enjoying a short getaway in the countryside. Roland had mentioned his interest in follies to one other person, Patty Brennan, a robust divorcee who had worked for him briefly last year. Roland thought he fancied Patty, but they never got beyond the talking stage. "You mean like Coney Island or Grant's Tomb?" had been her reaction when he told her about follies. Well, no, not exactly. Perhaps Roland had explained it badly. He decided then and there to keep the world of follies to himself. His little secret. Patty soon fell in love with the man who cleaned the heads of her VCR and quit to take a position in his business. It was all for the best, Roland convinced himself. When you share something you treasure with another person, it's no longer quite so special. It inevitably loses a little of its magic aura. Roland made fairly good time, but the actual journey clocked in at closer to 300 miles, so it was a little after 6 in the evening when he reached Glen Allen. He passed by the Glen Motel on his way into town, but found no other accommodation, and eventually circled back to it. A satellite dish, a room full of vending machines, 3 other cars parked in the lot. Nothing at all like a rustic inn, but it would have to do. Roland went into the office and paid for a room. The middle-aged woman on duty took his cash, gave him a key and some brochures about the boating and fishing opportunities in the vicinity. "Where's the best place to eat in town?" Roland asked.
"Bill's Friendly Grill, right on Main,"
the woman replied.
"By the way, there's an electrical storm supposed to come through tonight. If the power goes out, you'll find some candles in your closet."
"Thanks. I was thinking of taking a look at the Jorgensen estate tomorrow. Is it hard to find?"
"The Jorgensen estate?"
she repeated carefully, as if giving the matter some thought. She was a large woman with bland, empty features.
"No, it's not hard to find, but it might be hard to get to. It's just a couple miles up the Glen, but nobody's lived there in about 30 years. So the private road's all overgrown. You'll have to hike some."
Then added,
"From what I heard, there's nothing much left to see."
"Oh."
"Are you in real estate?"
No, I represent well, it's a British fellowship, you see, and we're interested in neglected sites of architectural distinction." He was upset with himself for hesitating and then failing to utter the word folly, but there was no point in trying to explain it to this woman. As it was, she made a vague sound and appeared to have no interest whatsoever.
"Well, I could be wrong, but I don't think you'll find there is any architecture up there."
"None at all?" Roland asked in disbelief. Until now, he hadn't even considered the possibility that he might have come all this way on a wild goose chase. "There's nothing left?" The woman shrugged blithely, seeming to take pleasure in his distress.
"Place burned down ages ago."
She picked up the book she had been reading, a paperback account of some lurid murders in Texas, and found her place. "Ah, well." His room was adequate, just. There was mildew on the shower curtain, and the air had a damp, musty smell that some people regard as the authentic flavor of the countryside, but the sheets were clean, and the air conditioner worked. Outside, the heat and humidity were nearly as oppressive as they'd been in Rye. Roland decided not to linger in his room. He was hungry and a storm was coming. He left his overnight bag still packed on a rock maple armchair, left his camera locked in the trunk of his car, and set off to find Bill's Friendly Grill. Glenallen, what there was of it, had the peeling, outdated look of a town still stuck in the 40s or 50s. It was not unpleasant. The weathered clapboards, the old flying red horse gas pumps, the rusty cars and battered pickups, the general store with a group of kids hanging around out front, a curious mix of what was genuinely quaint and what was merely Tobacco Road. But it wasn't what was there, Roland realized as he parked. It was what wasn't there. No trendy boutiques, no video stores, no t-shirt joints, no fast food chains, no blaring boomboxes, not even one odorific Chinese takeaway. That was somehow pleasing. The present had not yet arrived in Glenallen, at least not with the full force of all its tawdry enterprise. Roland sat at the bar and had the cheeseburger deluxe, which was suitably greasy and rather good. The fries were on the soggy side, but the coleslaw was tangy and delicious. Roland washed it all down with a large mug of cold beer, the first of several he would enjoy that evening. There were a handful of other customers, regulars it seemed, who clutched their glasses, kept an eye on the Yankees game on the TV at the far end of the bar, and chatted easily with each other. None of them showed any particular interest in Roland, which was fine with him. Most of them were young and probably knew nothing firsthand about the Jorgensens. But Roland did eventually manage to learn something from Bill, the elderly owner of the place, who also presided over the bar.
Old man Jorgensen made it big in steel, right up there with Carnegie. A lot of money. My father worked on the house when they built it back in the 20s. Oh, it was beautiful. Wood from South America, marble from Italy, you name it. French furniture, big paintings on the walls, no expense spared. They lived there about 2 months a year every summer. They called it a cottage, because it only had about 20 rooms.
Roland nodded, smiling. Bill had a way of saying something and slapping his hand lightly on the bar as if to signal that he was finished. He would turn and drift away, tending to his other customers, but sooner or later he would wander back to Roland and continue, gradually filling in the rest of the story. The Jorgensen clan came and went year after year. They kept pretty much to themselves. Nothing memorable happened until the winter of 1959, when the house burned down mysteriously. It was gutted, a complete loss. The only people there at the time were the caretaker and his wife, both of whom died in the blaze. Some people thought it was an accident, others that local vandals were responsible. The rich are always resented. There was a lengthy investigation, but no final verdict. The place was abandoned. The Jorgensens never came back. It wasn't until a few years ago that the estate was in the news once more. A new generation of Jorgensens had seen fit, no doubt with tax considerations in mind, to deed the 100-plus acres to the state of New York. The surrounding Adirondack forest had already reclaimed it, and now it was a legal fact. "Weren't there any other buildings besides the main house?" Roland asked anxiously. "Any other structures?"
"Oh, sure," Bill said. "There was a big garage, a gazebo, a few sheds, and an ice house. And, Little Italy."
"What?" Roland's hopes soared. "Little Italy?"
"Yeah, my kids used to play there when they were growing up back in the 60s. Crazy thing."
It was a folly, no question. It seemed that the old man had been in love with Italy, so much so that he decided to create a garden that featured miniature replicas of famous Italian sites: the Trevi Fountain, Vesuvius and Pompeii, the Blue Grotto at Capri, and the Colosseum, among others. Jorgensen had added to it every summer for nearly 3 decades, and by the time of the fire, the Italian garden was said to cover nearly 4 acres. Roland was both encouraged and depressed. Yes, there was an authentic folly, but it had been rotting away since 1959, exposed to hot summers, freezing winters, and the random violence of local kids. Whatever still survived was no doubt crumbling in the grip of the forest. It was sad, and Roland thought he would be lucky to get one halfway decent photograph. But it was certainly worth writing up and publishing, It would be Roland Turner's first appearance in the pages of the Fellowship magazine. It was well past 10 when he finally left the bar. The heat had eased considerably, and a breeze blew through town. The storm was closer. Roland could only hope it would be long gone when he went looking for the Jorgensen place in the morning. He caught a glimpse of lightning in the sky, but it seemed far away, and there was no following rumble of thunder. Main Street was now deserted, and Roland thought it looked a bit like an abandoned movie set. Signs swayed, windows rattled, leaves and dust swirled about, and everything was cast in the dim yellow glow of a few widely spaced street lamps. The bright neon Genesee sign at Bill's stood out in welcome contrast. Roland was about to get into his car when he first heard the sound. And he stopped to listen to it. Choir practice? No, this was not musical in the sense that it followed any pattern. It was not even human. Roland slowly turned his head, trying to figure out which direction it came from. But it was too diffuse, and the wind in the trees frequently overwhelmed it. Back at the motel, Roland heard the sound again as soon as he stepped out of his car. It was stronger and clearer, yet just as hard to define as it had been in town. An Aeolian chorus that sang in the night, rising and fading, shrilling and moaning. The wind was part of it, but there had to be more. Some unusual local feature that produced this effect. Roland actually liked it. He was reminded of certain ethereal passages from Debussy and Vaughan Williams. In his room, he turned off the air conditioner, opened a window, and listened to it a while longer. The storm passed by a few miles to the north, crackling and thundering in the distance like a transient war, and the village of Glen Allen took an intense strafing of rain. But it was gone in a quarter of an hour, and its aftermath was a humid, dripping stillness. In the morning, as he was about to set off for the Jorgensen place, Roland spotted the woman who ran the motel. She came out of the vending machine room with a full garbage sack in one hand. Roland crossed the parking lot and asked her about the sounds he had heard the previous night.
That's just the wind coming down the glen.
She told him.
When it blows a certain direction, you get that.
Yes, but what exactly causes it?
The wind coming down the glen,
She repeated, as if he were dense.
You don't notice it so much in the winter.
Ah. He stopped at Colbert's store a few doors up from Bill's on Main Street to buy a grinder and a carton of juice for lunch. A few minutes later, he nearly drove past what had been the entrance to the Jorgensen summer estate. As Bill had explained it, it wasn't hard to find. About 2 miles up from North Street, which was the only road north out of town, and look for it on your left. There were 2 stone columns flanking a single-lane driveway. Roland backed up and studied the scene for a moment. The stone columns bore the dead pastel blue and green stains of lichen, and their caps were severely chipped and cracked. The wrought iron gate was long gone, only a pair of deeply corroded hinges remained. Then Roland realized that Jorgensen had planted a wall of arbor vitae along the road in both directions. It could still be seen, but barely. It must have reached 20 or 30 feet high, but now it was a skeletal ruin, shot through with tall weeds, young maples, choke cherries, wild grapes, and other vines and parasites. The entryway itself was so thick with brush that Roland couldn't even park in it. He had to go another 50 yards before he found a grassy spot on the right. He slung his camera around his neck, took his lunch cooler, locked the car, and walked back down the road. The original dirt road to the house was thoroughly overgrown with weeds and field grass, but it wasn't hard to follow. Roland wandered off it twice and immediately noticed the change from the firm gravel base to a more yielding soil underfoot. He passed through a tunnel of trees, a landscape effect that may well have been quite lovely once. Now it was ragged, dark, and gloomy, devastated by secondary growth. He came out of it on the edge of a large clearing and sensed that he was now close to the site of the house. It was no longer cleared at all, of course. but the perimeter was unmistakably marked by the much taller pine trees of the surrounding forest. Roland's pants were soaked. The sky was overcast, so all of the plants he waded through were still wet from the rain, but he preferred it that way to a blazing hot sun. He followed the road as it climbed, a very gradual rise, and then leveled off. Yes, he thought excitedly, this has to be it. Where else would you build a house? The 3 or 4 acres of flat, high ground he stood on provided a gorgeous southern view. Roland gazed down across the old clearance, looking for any human traces. There was a small lake, perhaps Jorgensen had it created for him, and the stumpy remnants of a wooden pier. The lake was nearly dead now, choked with algae, reeds, and silt, but it must have been beautiful once. Roland found it easy to visualize the Jorgensen children out on the lake canoeing, or jumping from the pier and swimming. The family might well have had picnic lunches in the shade of the big sugar maple that still stood by itself, not far from the water. A view of the past, the lives, the dreams, so much effort to build a little world within the world. Were the Jorgensens haughty and unbearable, or decent and worthy of what they had? But it didn't matter, because what they had here was gone, and so were they. Roland turned and snagged his toe on a rock. It was part of the foundation of the house. He walked it, leaving his own trail in the tall grass and wildflowers. The fire and the years had left nothing but a rectangle of stones that barely protruded from the earth. The outbuildings had vanished as well. Maybe some of the locals had dismantled them for the lumber and fittings. Roland took a photograph of the ground on which the house had stood, and then another of the broad clearance, including the lake. He ate his lunch quickly, eyes scanning the landscape for a sign, a clue. If the Italian folly was hidden somewhere in the forest, he could spend a week looking for it. There was only one other possibility, somewhere up behind the house. Beyond a low ridge only 100 yards away, the land seemed to hollow out as steep walls formed on either side. That was north. That was the beginning of the glen, or the end of it. Roland trudged up the rise and gaped. There it was. Little Italy. Jorgensen's Folly. He was so excited he nearly broke into a run, but then he steadied himself and clicked off several shots of the whole panorama. There were all kinds of houses. Country villas, farmhouses, squat urban blocks, scattered in clumps and clusters. There were statues, many statues, fountains, archways, piazzas, towers, churches, stables, barns, and much more. It went on into the glen as far as Roland could see. The land on which most of the folly had been built was low, but it was marked by any number of little hillocks that enhanced the visual effect. In addition, the walls of the glen had a way of jutting out and cutting back that created niches, defiles, and recesses of varying size and depth. Every wacky detail somehow worked, and it all came together to create a remarkable illusion at first sight. In fact, it looked its best at a distance. When Roland came down the slope to it and began to make his way through the narrow passages, the decay was all too obvious. Most of the structures had been built with cinder blocks or plaster on chicken wire, and then coated with paint or whitewash. Tin roofs had been painted a reddish brown to suggest tile. Cheap stuff for a rich guy, and it showed the effects of age, neglect, and intermittent vandalism. Whole walls had been knocked down or worn away. Much of the tin was corroded, the paint blistered and peeling, what there still was of it. Statues were missing hands or heads, sometimes both. Everything was severely chipped or cracked. Brambles and vines proliferated, often making it difficult for Roland to move about. But in that respect, the folly had been spared worse damage. The ground was rocky and the soil thin, so not much else managed to grow there. Roland advanced slowly, taking pictures as he went. He knew little about Italy, but he recognized most of the famous landmarks Jorgensen had chosen to replicate. He was particularly impressed by a 50-foot section of the aqueduct, high enough to walk under without ducking his head. It was broken only in 3 places and actually dripped a tiny residue of last night's rain. Roland had to smile when he noticed that the plaster aqueduct was lined with cast-iron half-pipe. What really made the whole thing work was the dizzy range of scale, or rather, the complete lack of scale. A 2-foot house stood next to a 3-foot statue of a dog. Mount Etna was somehow smaller than the Duomo, while the Spanish Steps were larger than all of Venice. Nothing matched anything. That and sheer quirkiness. Working only 2 months a year, Jorgensen obviously felt compelled to add a number of ready-made items to his dream world. The statues, for instance. And Roland especially liked the bird bath, a common garden bird bath that utterly dominated St. Peter's Square. There were other bird baths to be seen, as well as birdhouses that could be purchased in any garden shop or nursery even today. Perhaps in the extreme reaches of his obsession, Jorgensen saw an ideal Italy populated solely by birds. Roland grinned a few moments later when he came across a statue of St. Francis of Assisi, surrounded by birdhouses that were mounted on sections of lead pipe, with the entire tableau situated between a trattoria and a bizarre little maze apparently meant to suggest the catacombs. Roland came into a small clearing with a stone bench. Maybe this was where old man Jorgensen sat, pondering his extraordinary creation and dreaming up more additions to it. Roland rested his feet for a moment and changed the film in his camera. It was easy to lose track of the size of the folly. Many of the structures were only 3 feet high, but quite a few were as tall as a man. And with the gently undulating flow of the ground, it was impossible to see ahead to the point where the folly displays finally came to an end. But it was also impossible to get lost, since the walls of the glen were always visible. Roland had to keep moving. The sky seemed to be darker now, not from the lateness of the hour, but from the appearance of more storm clouds. He hadn't thought to check the weather report, and he had no idea whether a new storm was due or it was the same one circling back. Roland didn't like the idea of having to hike all the way back to the car in a downpour, but it might come to that. He wasn't going to leave until he had seen and photographed every part of the folly. Jorgensen had saved his most astounding flight of fancy for the last. Roland stepped through a gap in a wall, and he thought that he was standing in a courtyard. A stretch of ground roughly 100 feet square had been covered with large paving stones that had subsequently buckled and heaved. Now the whole area was shot through with tufts of dull green weeds, laced with some kind of wild ground ivy. There was a line of columns along the left edge and another on the right. They were 10 or 12 feet high, and some of them had fallen over, but they created a sudden impression that still had power. Roland found himself thinking of the Pantheon, but he had no clear mental image of the original to compare. All this, however, was peripheral to the set piece straight ahead. Where the paving stones ended, the ground rose up slightly before it leveled off, creating a rough, natural platform. It was as wide as the courtyard, and it was full of statues. There were dozens of them. Roland stumbled forward. Several interesting features, he thought in a daze. All the statues were positioned to face the center of the glen. They all had their arms raised and their faces uplifted, as if acclaiming the gods or seeking their merciful help. None of them had hands. They had open mouths, but otherwise there were no facial features, not a nose or an eye or an ear in the entire assembly. They had no feet, unless they were buried in the ground, for the legs rose up out of the soil, converging in thick trunk-like torsos. The statues were crude and stark, and yet they seemed to be possessed of a terrible poignancy. They weren't presented as Romans in togas and robes. There were no gods or creatures of myth, not even a Venetian gondolier. They were like golems, clad in stone. Roland climbed the rise to inspect them close up. The surface was brownish in color, rough but firm in texture, like partly annealed sand. Perhaps there was an underlayer of plaster or cement. Roland had seen nothing else like it in Jorgensen's Little Italy. It was an improvement. These statues showed very little evidence of erosion. But what madness! Roland was in the middle of his final roll of film, snapping medium shots of the amazing statuary, when the first hand grabbed him by the belt in the small of his back. Then there were others on his body, pulling him down from behind. Something banged him along the side of the head, stunning him briefly. How much time had passed? Roland's vision was blurred and would not correct. His head throbbed painfully. It was dark, and the air was somehow different. Maybe he was in a cave. He could just make out flickering firelight and the busy movements of his captors. Roland couldn't move. They held him to the ground, his arms outstretched. They were like kids, not yet fully grown, voices unformed. He thought there were about a half dozen of them. He had no idea what was going on. He couldn't understand anything. An unnatural silence alarmed him. Roland tried to speak to them, but they sat on his chest and legs, pinned his head in place, and stuffed foul rags in his mouth. Then he saw the dull glint of an axe blade as it began its downward descent to the spot where his left hand was firmly held. Same thing on the right a few seconds later, but by then, Roland was already unconscious. Searing pain revived him. That and perhaps a lingering will to struggle and save his life. He was alone for the moment, but he could hear them, their squeaky murmurs, and a disturbing, wet, scraping noise. Demented teenagers. Maybe some weird sect or cult. Or they could be a brain-stunted, inbred rural clan that preyed on anyone who was foolish enough to stray into their territory. How could this happen? Was the whole town in on it? What could they want? Perhaps in exploring and photographing Jorgensen's Italian folly, he had somehow violated their sacred ground. But it seemed most likely that they were insane, pure and simple. Roland still couldn't move. His wrist stumps were bandaged. The bastards had actually chopped his hands off. The realization nearly knocked him out again, but Roland fought off total panic. He had to think clearly, or he was surely lost. The rest of his body from the neck down seemed to be wrapped in some kind of wire mesh. His mouth was still clogged with the hideous rags, and he had to breathe through his nose. He tried to lever his tongue to push the rags out, or to one side so he could speak, but at that moment they came back for him. They dragged him, and it became clear to Roland that some of the monstrous pain he felt was coming from where his 2 feet had been. They threw him down in a torchlit clearing. They spread his legs, held his arms out, and began to smear some thick, gooey substance on him. Roland flipped and squirmed like a fish on the floor of a boat until they clubbed him again. Fresh air, dusk light. The same day? Couldn't be. But overcast, the wind whipping loudly, and that choral sound Roland had heard his first night in town. They carried him out of the cave, and the wailing noise seemed to fill his brain. He was in the center of it, and it was unbearable. Only his head was exposed. The rest of his body now stone. It came up to his neck in a rigid collar and forced his head back at a painful angle. Roland caught sight of them as they propped him in his place on the third rank of the statuary. They weren't kids. They didn't even look human. Pinched little faces, stubby fingers, a manic bustle to their movements, and the insect jabber that was all but lost in the boiling wind. Like caricature scientists, they turned him one way and then another, tilting, nudging, and adjusting. They finally yanked the rags out of his mouth. Roland tried to croak out a few words, but his tongue was too dry. Then the final mystery was solved, as his captors thrust a curious device into his mouth. He saw it for an instant, a wire cage that contained several loose wooden balls. They were varying sizes, and Roland thought he saw grooves and holes cut in them. It fit so well that his tongue was pressed to the floor of his mouth. A couple of strands of rawhide were tied around his head, securing the device even more tightly. A last corrective nudge, and then the wind took hold and the wooden balls danced and bounced. Another voice joined the choir. Satisfied, they went on to complete their work, covering the rest of his head with the sticky cement, and then applying the exterior finish. Only his open mouth was left untouched. Roland thought of insects nesting there. He pictured a warm mist billowing out on cool mornings as he rotted inside. And he wondered how long it would take to die. They must do repair work later to keep the cages in place after the flesh disappeared. A strangely comforting thought in the giddy swirl of despair. The wind came gusting down the glen. Empty arms raised, his anonymous face lifted to the unseeing sky. He sang.
Special appearance by Cheryl Albino. Sound engineer, Joshua Rodas. Music by Jordan Peer. This has been a Watertown Arts production.